I'm Ryan Emanuel, and I'm here today with my brother Joey, and we're members of the Lumbee tribe. We're the children of Lanny Emanuel from the Saddle Tree community and Pam Odom Emanuel from the Sandy Plains community. Our Emanuel family actually descends from the Kahari tribe, who are our neighbors about 20 miles to the north. But our family is also made up of Locklears, Oxendines, Mainers, which are many common names among the Lumbee. Our parents and grandparents grew up in segregated Indian schools in Robeson County, which is the heart of Lumbee territory. One exception is that one of our grandfathers was from East Tennessee and of European descent. He and our grandmother met in the military after World War II. He moved with our grandmother to Robeson County, where he spent the rest of his relatively short life, dying several years before we were born. So now you've heard one version of the way that I introduce myself in the Lumbee way. I want to thank the Lumbee people for your hospitality and for the example that you set of Indigenous leadership on issues related to the environment. I want to orient you to the Lumbee world and to my experiences as a Lumbee academic before I tell you a brief story about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. I hope to finish by sharing some of the lessons that are still in the learning and still in the making for all of us. So I'm Lumbee, and our people share our name with our river. It runs through the southeastern portion of what is today North Carolina. So this is the coastal plain, about 60 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. We sometimes call ourselves the people of the dark water. The scientists call our type of stream a blackwater stream. So from far away, the water actually does look black. From close up, it's the color of a rich tea. This is because of all the dissolved organic matter that's present in the water naturally. This is its pure, unadulterated form. It's dark water. We love it, and it's our home. The river and its surrounding wetlands and swamps nurture us, and they've protected us. So for many generations, our people were left alone there until our timber and our agricultural land were deemed valuable by colonial powers. The river's been a strategic asset to our people as well through time. During and immediately after the Civil War, Henry Berry Lowry, who was a Lumbee hero and leader, used the swamps that surround the Lumbee River as a hideout and a home base to battle injustices, first against the Confederate authorities and later against the United States. And my grandparents' generation, when my parents were children, in 1958, the Ku Klux Klan decided to come to Robeson County to put the Indians in their place. They publicly announced that they were going to hold a rally at a site called Hayes Pond, a few miles from our hometown of Pembroke, North Carolina. On the evening of their rally in January of 1958, they started up a generator in a rented field that was going to power a PA system and a single light bulb hanging overhead. As soon as they turned on the light bulb, between 400 and 500 Lumbees, armed, came out of the swamps, surrounded 50 Klansmen, and drove them from the field. So that was the end of the Klan in Robeson County. But the river continues to define our communities today. Saddle Tree, Burnt Swamp, Bear Swamp. These are the names of swamps. These are the names of wetlands. But this is also how we identify ourselves. We say that we're from Saddle Tree, or we're from Burnt Swamp, or we're from Bear Swamp, or Back Swamp. When we say, is so-and-so on the swamp, that means, are they home? Are they in the neighborhood? So this is a real and present part of our identity. It's also important to note for this story that the Lumbee people do not have full federal recognition from the U.S. government. We were recognized by the state of North Carolina as an Indian tribe in 1885, and immediately our leaders began petitioning the federal government for recognition as well. In 1956, Congress passed the Lumbee Act, which acknowledged us as Indian people in name only, but prohibited the tribe from accessing any resources available to other tribes. And for context, this was during the termination era. I'm also a Lumbee hydrologist, so I'm a water scientist. And I was trained in the Western way. I went through the Western Academy. And I'm not a scholar of indigenous knowledges, or at least I don't feel like one, but I know that I'm a beneficiary of indigenous knowledges. Our parents felt so strongly the Lumbee ethic for education that they actually moved away from our homeland during the tumultuous years immediately following the height of the civil rights era. They left Robeson County and moved 2 hours away to the city. And one of the main reasons for doing that was to give us, quote unquote, a better education. They weren't willing to move so far away that we couldn't still spend most of our weekends and all of our important holidays with our Lumbee family. And so for many years, I thought that going away and giving an education so that I could give back to my community meant doing things like STEM outreach, which was something that I was really passionate about, and I still am. Returning to a Lumbee community and getting students energized and excited about water or about the environmental sciences. This is a fun thing to do, but it was also a very comfortable thing for me. This was in my safe space, and I was good at it for a long time, or at least I thought that I was. But a few years ago, North Carolina's Commission of Indian Affairs, which is a state government arm that represents all of North Carolina's tribes and urban Indian organizations, asked me if I would be on their newly formed Environmental Justice Committee. So at the time, I didn't really even know what environmental justice was. But I said, yes, I will do this thing. Maybe that's a cautionary tale. But what I've come to learn in the past few years on this committee is that some of the work that I'm asked to do is more like that of a mediator between my tribe, other tribes in the state, and these Western institutions. These institutions, like our state and federal governments or large corporations, they are the ones that have all the power and are making the decisions. They're also the ones, or at least in the case of our government agencies, they're the ones that are called to respect environmental justice, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in the environmental decision-making process. And it plays out in the following way. Federal agencies are required to evaluate the impacts of their regulated projects on poor and minority communities, and to the extent possible, they have to address those impacts. Now that last language, to the extent possible, that's a loophole a mile wide, but there is no loophole when it comes to acknowledging the impacts. So they must acknowledge the impacts of regulated projects on poor and minority communities. So right now, I'm on a journey with my tribe and with other tribes in our region to understand how to translate our values and our ways of knowing to these institutions that are actually charged with evaluating environmental justice. And this is a strange and less comfortable place to be in, but this is this is where we are now. And I want to give you a quick example, and that example is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. This is a proposed 600-mile fossil fuel pipeline that would carry shale gas, which is extracted through hydraulic fracturing in West Virginia, and it will be pumped across the state of Virginia and to endpoints near Norfolk by the coast, and a southern endpoint is in the heart of Lumbee territory. It's a community called Prospect, which is so proud of its record in business leadership and education leadership in Indian country that when you drive into Prospect, there's a sign that says the cradle of Indian prosperity. So maybe that title is up for debate, but they're really proud of who they are. And on its way from West Virginia to North Carolina, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline crosses the territories of 4 tribes in North Carolina. Federal regulators failed to consult with any of these tribes while they were preparing a major environmental review. This is a review that took over a year to prepare, some 1,000 pages of documentation, And I did a word search at one point for the name of my tribe, Lumbee, in the draft environmental statement. I think there were 4 references in the entire PDF, and some of them had to do with the name of a soil. Somewhere along the pipeline, there was a Lumbee soil. You could do other word searches for endangered species. There are bats, salamanders, and other animals, and you'll come across hundreds and hundreds of references if you do word searches. So it was puzzling to me how a draft environmental impact statement that purported to do such a thorough job could so thoroughly leave out my tribe and leave out the other tribes along the pipeline route. Some other things that bothered me is that it was troubling that they made no mention that there are 30,000 American Indians who live in census tracts within the study corridor. 30,000 people. That's a quarter of all the American Indians in North Carolina. If you look at the data another way, 13% of all the people that live in the study corridor in North Carolina are American Indians. And in our state, the statewide population is just over 1% American Indian. When you look at the summary statement for the environmental review for this project, there's one bullet that stands out. There will be no environmental justice impacts associated with this project. And when I read that, my jaw hit the floor. I did not pull these statistics from some magical Indian census. I don't have any special data that I can go to pull these statistics. I got these statistics from Appendix U, the 21st appendix of this environmental review document. There is a table that has the U.S. Census data for the entire study region. So federal regulators have those data that they could have used to do a simple total of the number of American Indians living in those census tracts. They could have calculated the population statistics and saw that 13% of these people in these census tracts are American Indians, and they did not. Instead, they concluded there are no disproportionate impacts. So I deconstructed the environmental justice review that the federal officials did, and I found major flaws, obviously, in the method that they use. Okay, so you could describe it as a form of gerrymandering. I sent regulators a detailed explanation of those flaws. I linked them back to policy guidance from NEPA and from Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Guidance for both of these federal laws says that you're only required to consult with federally recognized tribes, but we strongly encourage you to consult formally with all indigenous peoples, regardless of their recognition status, if they are affected by these projects. So I fed them back not only a review of what was wrong with their analysis, but I also explained using their own words why it's important that they do so and do it correctly. So I followed this with several months of working with my tribal leaders and other tribal leaders across the state to do things like craft responses to this draft document, formal responses that are filed through the public comments period, and also to listen to communities. This is something that I learned and something that I've been guilty of, even though I come from these communities. I still am affected and infected by the Western Academy that produced me as a scholar. And it's hard to retune myself to a place of listening and sitting silently and often just grieving with these people who feel that they have no voice whatsoever in the process of making decisions about their own homelands. So what's the broader response? Tribal responses have been complicated. My tribe, I'm proud to say, after many months of discussion and prayer and thinking clearly about this, they passed a resolution from the Tribal Council unanimously that opposed any pipeline permitting that did not involve formal consultation with the tribal government. Two tribes in North Carolina joined an unsuccessful suit to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to force federal regulators to reopen the case and allow information from tribal consultation. The Fourth Circuit said that they could not accept these arguments because federal regulators have already said that a review is pending, but there is no timeline for when they could make a decision about whether or not to allow additional information into this review. In fact, it's so ambiguous that the pipeline could be built and operating before they ever decide that they're going to hear more evidence on the environmental and cultural impacts. Members of our tribe produced a report calling for a cultural impact assessment of this pipeline. That was encouraging. And then some tribes have said, you know what, this is a done deal and we don't want to be involved. We're going to devote our resources elsewhere. And those are decisions that they have had to make for themselves. So it's complicated. State governments want to be helpful, but they actually feel like in North Carolina that they don't have the authority to make environmental justice decisions. They've said this is a federal matter and we're washing our hands of it. From the corporations, I can only say that it's been crushing and relentless marketing. So they've passed off this pipeline as climate friendly. They've conflated their own marketing activities with consultation. And some quick examples, they filed federal reports that were titled Consultation with Indian Tribes, and these reports listed their presentations to tribes. And we know that is not consultation. If the regulators aren't in the room or participating, that can't be described as consultation. Let's see, here's a quote from my school newspaper where the developer's representative says, "We sought an audience with them being the Indian tribes, for a couple of years without success. But lately, in the past 6 months, we've had much better ways to get with some of their leaders and talk about the benefits." So in other words, the past couple of years, when Indigenous peoples have been working on this themselves and bringing in allies to think about this in strategic ways, the developers had trouble getting through to them. But lately, we can claim victory as developers because we've finally been able to explain to them why we're right and they're wrong. That's how I interpret that statement. And then lastly, just this week, the developer has argued that the pipeline will help restore social justice in North Carolina. So here's a quote: "The pipeline will actually help restore social justice, providing opportunity and paving the way for prosperity in some of the most disadvantaged counties in North Carolina." That's a disappointing, to say the least, response from a corporation that claims to be very responsible. That's a very disappointing response. I'll leave it at that. So quickly, what lessons can we learn? Our tribes in North Carolina are in a really tough position. They have little capacity to respond to threats to sovereignty. There are no tribal historic preservation offices among any of these tribes. There are like little sinking islands with no lifelines. The sea is rising all around them, and by the sea I mean this pipeline, other development projects, and other things that are happening, and the tribes feel like they have no control whatsoever over the environmental impacts that are circling and closing in all around them. Landscapes are being lost and degraded, and with those landscapes, our indigenous identity is also being lost. So this pipeline is the worst possible timing for us because we're just beginning some revitalization of language and material culture that connects intimately to these landscapes. So the question is, and can we build capacity before it's too late? And this is a very pressing question because just a couple of weeks ago, another pipeline developer announced that they were going to build a pipeline into North Carolina that will run within 5 miles of the major settlement of another one of our tribes. So lack of federal recognition doesn't excuse us from fighting for the environment, from fighting for our culture, and fighting for our future. So there's no functional policy or precedent in the things that are going on in North Carolina right now. So we're creating these de facto policies by what tribes do or do not decide to do. So if tribes are quiet on this pipeline and on other infrastructure that invades our territories without our free, prior, and informed consent, we're just reinforcing the status quo. So if people shut down on this pipeline, the one that was just announced 2 weeks ago, they'll know that we've got this. We have no need to ask for consultation between federal regulators and tribes. We have no need to worry about indigenous peoples at all. If tribes speak up for their inherent sovereignty, they might not stop this pipeline, but they could change the way that people think about environmental justice and meaningful engagement with people who have long been treated as invisible. So the invisibility problem is real among Indians in North Carolina. My ancestors fought this invisibility because they knew that it had been weaponized and used against us. So I'm convinced that this chapter in the history of my tribe, which is really similar to experiences of indigenous peoples everywhere, is bringing potentially new ceremonies to our people. Now, I don't know what they will look like. I'm not a spiritual leader. I'm not a cultural leader. I'm also not a policy expert or a social scientist or an activist. I feel like I spend most of my time these days explaining what I'm not. But I am a Lumbee, and I know who my people are. We honor our elders, living and deceased, and we're going to carry on their work to fight invisibility. We respect our land and our water by treating it gently and thinking about the best ways to interact with the world around us. I want to share with you a quote by a Lumbee leader who passed away a couple of years ago, Ms. Ruth Rebels. Back in the 1970s, during the American Indian movement height, there was a lot of activity in this movement in Robeson County. And somehow, indirectly associated with this activity, the main building at the university that Lumbee people founded in the 1800s burned down one night. It burned to a brick shell. Arson, never solved. The community was devastated. So in the wake of all this, Ms. Ruth wrote about the potential to lose this building and the potential to restore it. She said, "There's more than one way to own a thing. Some of the most precious things in life were not bought and paid for with money." Now, she said that about a building, but I came across that quote a few months after she passed away, and I talked to her family, and they said, yes, we think that she would want this applied to our landscapes and our waterways as well. So we often take quotes and we take sayings and we take words from other indigenous leaders, but now I feel like we have our own homegrown quote that we can use from now on. So Lumbee people also make decisions with future generations in mind. We make sacrifices in our time so that the future generations can continue to live as Lumbee people, knowing that the rivers, swamps, and wetlands and communities will be present to support them and sustain them no matter where they are. So thanks.